Hello, my name is Tim Riesen. I'm a research assistant professor in the Department of Special Education and Rehabilitation, and I also have an appointment in the Center for Persons with Disabilities at Utah State University. Today I'm going to talk about instructional strategies for the acquisition and maintenance of customized job tasks. So before I get into talking about instructional strategies, I just want to provide a little bit of background about why employment of people with disabilities is important and why developing instructional supports that use evidence-based practices is really important as well. So we all know that promoting meaningful pathways to employment is an important advocacy, policy, and research priority. And one of the reasons why this is such an important policy and research priority is because of the perennial poor outcomes for people with disabilities. So if you've seen the employment data out there, it doesn't look very promising. In fact, if you look at the American Community Survey, approximately 35% of people with disabilities are employed. And if you distill that data down a little bit further and look at populations such as intellectual developmental disabilities, we see that roughly 18% of people with intellectual developmental disabilities are employed in competitive integrated employment, whereas roughly 80% of people, that same population, is employed or receives services in facility-based work and non-work settings. So we're not doing a great job in terms of promoting employment for people with disabilities. So we're continually searching for ways that are going to improve these outcomes and get us away from those pretty poor, the poor percentages for people with disabilities. Customized employment is one of those pathways that emerged in the early 2000s, and it was really designed to support people with more significant disabilities in finding meaningful employment. And it was codified in 2014 when the Rehabilitation Act was amended in WIOA. So now customized employment is an important service provision for people with disabilities. And it's really designed to help people with disabilities find a job that's meaningful, that's based on his or her strengths and interests, but also aligns with the needs of the employers. So when we're doing customized employment well, we engage in a nice discovery process that really figures out what a person would like to do in terms of employment, and then we match those needs to the employer. But what we're finding when we're implementing customized employment and other employment support strategies is that we have an absence of highly trained employment specialists to deliver these instructional strategies well. This means that people with disabilities, particularly those with more significant disabilities, are going to employment settings and not rapidly learning employment skills quickly. And so this creates a problem both for the person with a disability and the employer, because we want individuals to perform these skills rapidly and learn these skills. So when we're implementing customized employment, it becomes paramount that employment specialists really understand how to deliver systematic instruction and the strategies that I'm going to be talking about in this webcast. Furthermore, we also know that when people are delivering instructional supports to people with disabilities, that they often use inappropriate prompting strategies during training for acquisition of customized employment tasks. So these inappropriate prompting strategies lead to a sense of prompt dependency for people with disabilities. So what happens when we're using these inappropriate prompting strategies, people with disabilities then become dependent on employment specialists to help them complete a customized job task or an employment task. And so if we are looking at improving these employment outcomes for people with the most significant disabilities, we really need to make sure that we're using these strategies that work. We're using these strategies that are going to promote rapid acquisition of a specific employment task. So we know when we're implementing instruction in customized employment that the success of a customized job is really contingent on a number of factors. First and foremost, and I've already kind of alluded to this, is that we're looking at that match of the individual skills to the customized job task. So this means that during the discovery process, we really look at the strengths and interests of the individuals. And during that process, we're also looking at how best to teach this individual and how we can utilize specific strategies so they could rapidly acquire the skills to engage in a customized job task. We also know that when we're implementing instruction, we have to use evidence-based practices for teaching the acquisition and maintenance of customized job tasks. We don't want to use anecdotal strategies. We want to use strategies that we know work. And so there are a number of different systematic instructional strategies that one can use in terms of teaching a person a new skill. And I'm going to focus on a couple of them, a couple of these strategies in today's webinar. But the application of evidence-based practices is really one of the things that that is missing in terms of promoting better outcomes for individuals with disabilities. We need to ensure that folks understand the evidence-based practices for teaching and they understand how to apply them in employment settings. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of these instructional strategies, but I first want to review some guidelines that are kind of important in terms of selecting the most effective instructional strategy to use in an employment setting. And first and foremost, as I already alluded, we want to use effective and efficient strategies. We want to use those strategies that are going to produce a result. So this, once again, takes us back to the discovery phase and takes us back to when we're learning about the strengths, interests, and needs of an individual. We really have to figure out the ways that that individual is going to respond and the ways that we're going to utilize some form of instructional strategy that's going to really increase the likelihood that the person will learn a new task or learn a customized employment task. We also want to ensure that when we're teaching that we select instructional strategies that result in fewer instructional trials. So when we're teaching an individual with a disability to do a new task, we don't want to spend forever teaching that task. We want to engage in instruction that's where we only have a few instructional trials, so rapid acquisition, that promotes fewer errors and that we have less trainer involvement. So the quicker we can train an individual to do an employment task, the better the outcome for the individual with a disability and the better the outcome for the employer. So we really want to make sure that we're utilizing these effective and efficient strategies. Second, we want to use less restrictive and less intrusive strategies. So we want to get away from strategies that impinge, demoralize, stigmatize, or intrude on a person with a disability. So when you watch somebody who's using these strategies, response prompting strategies effectively, and who is implementing a really solid systematic instruction programming, it really is effortless in some respects. You can't really tell that they're doing it. So we want to make sure that we're using these least restrictive, less intrusive strategies when we're teaching a person with a disability to perform a new skill or a new task. We also want to ensure that we're facilitating learner-directed strategies to the extent possible. So it's really important that we, during the discovery process, that we figure out how that person will best learn, and are there certain compensatory strategies that we can implement when when teaching a individual with a disability to a new task. We also want to ensure that instruction leads to independent performance. That's the point of teaching an individual, is so that they can independently perform that specific task. We also want to ensure that instruction is individualized and effective for that person. So you can see a pattern here that everything that we do in terms of instruction is tied back to what we've learned during the discovery process of how this person will learn, what strategies they're going to respond to, right? And then finally, we want to make sure that we're collecting performance data. And this is an area that I see in my work that we aren't necessarily good at doing. A lot of employment specialists don't collect performance data on outcomes for an individual with disability. And in my mind, when we're teaching an individual a new skill, it's really important that we collect that data so we know if that acquisition is occurring. If we don't have good solid data, then we can't really determine whether or not that person is learning a specific employment task. So a couple of things that I would like to review before we get into specific instructional strategies is like what we're teaching and the context for teaching. So when we start teaching an individual a skill, there are two types of behaviors or skills that we commonly refer to, one of which is a discrete skill or behavior. And this skill has a clear beginning and an end, and it's typically only a single response. So that might be something like ladling some sauce on a pizza. That's one single response, right? But we typically don't do those in employment settings. What we do is these skills or behaviors are often comprised of a complex behavior chain. And these complex behavior chains are a sequence of these discrete behaviors in which the completion of each response is a cue to engage in the next response. So it's a chain of events that leads to a larger outcome. And these complex behavior chains are what we do in employment settings. So they're the core routines that we see in a customized job. And we use task analysis to really pinpoint what an individual needs to do in order to complete that specific job task. So that task analysis, when we're thinking about instruction and thinking about how we're going to implement instruction in a customized employment setting, is really the starting point of systematic instruction. So when we're working with an individual, we identify these core routines that an individual would do in a customized setting. And then if an individual is having difficulty implementing any of these core routines or performing any of these core routines or tasks, then we develop a task analysis for teaching purposes. So the task analysis helps us really wrap our heads around what that person needs to do in order to perform that specific task successfully. So when we are developing a task analysis, it's oriented around the accomplishment of a single task within a routine, right? And then we organize and sequence steps of a task for teaching purposes, meaning we want to make sure this is logical and that it makes sense when we create our specific task analysis. That these discrete steps, if an individual engages in each one of these discrete steps of the task analysis, it's going to result in the completion of that specific task. We also use a task analysis to promote consistent and reliable training. So this really a task analysis is a blueprint for the employment specialist and for the person with a disability, so we can really understand what that individual needs to do in order to be successful on the job. And finally, we can use a task analysis as a data collection system. So going back to my previous point, that if we're going to be teaching an individual a skill, and especially when we're looking at individuals with significant support needs or individuals with the most significant disabilities, this data collection becomes paramount, that we really need to ensure that we have a reliable system to track what's happening in terms of performance, because we want to see that independent performance at the customized employment setting. And a task analysis, it allows us to do that. So this is an example of a task analysis that I created in terms of for a study that we were looking at different prompting strategies in an employment setting, and this was for making a pan pizza at a local restaurant. And so you can see that when we're developing a task analysis, we highlight the stimulus material or the stimulus that cues the individual to respond, and then we highlight the task that the individual would need to do, each one of the steps in the task analysis. So the stimulus is what cues an individual to perform the step in the task. And so on this task analysis, there are 10 specific steps. And so the first step is pretty straightforward. It's just place a square deep dish pan on the prep station. So that individual would set that pan on the deep dish on the prep station, and then they start going down the steps of the task analysis. So from an instructional standpoint, how I'm going to use this specific task analysis is it's going to allow me to highlight perhaps where the individual is having trouble. So rather than teaching the whole skill of making a pan pizza in this example, I can simply highlight the step where the individual is having difficulty and teach that specific step. And so when we highlight or we isolate where an individual is having trouble, it's going to help us develop an instructional program to rapidly teach that person that skill. And the person will acquire that skill much quicker if we just simply, have the person repeat each one of these steps. And we hope that through repeated trials that the person's going to complete the task of making a pizza. From an instructional standpoint, I want to go in and highlight, figure out where the problem is, and then teach that specific skill. So how do we use a task analysis during this acquisition of these new customized job tasks? Well, typically what we do, and when we're thinking about systematic instruction and how to implement instruction, is we use response prompting and fading. So this is a really important thing component to discuss, because going back to the previous slide, what we know about people with disabilities, particularly those with more significant disabilities, those with significant support needs, is that they become dependent on the prompts that an employment specialist delivers. So they may know how to do the task, but they wait for those prompts. And once again, this is a problem of not using instructional strategies effectively. So when we're starting to teach and implement instruction in customized employment, we want to ensure that we're using appropriate response prompting and fading strategies. So response prompting and fading are basically when behaviors of a person or other type of stimulus material that increases the probability that a person with a disability will engage in that correct behavior. So going back to the pizza example that I was talking about earlier. So when we're making a pan pizza, or any individual's making a pan pizza, hopefully that person will recognize the stimulus that cues him or her to move to the next step. But oftentimes, a person doesn't recognize that stimulus, and we as an instructor serve as that stimulus by providing a prompt. Once we provide that prompt, that person moves to that next step on the task analysis. Now, when we're teaching a person a new skill during this acquisition phase, what we want to see happen is what we call a transfer of stimulus control, meaning that the person starts to recognize the stimulus in the natural environment, and they no longer need our prompt for that individual to complete that task. So this transfer is really important, and it's a really important piece of this instructional piece. That transfer of stimulus control is what we want to see happening in any form of instructional context. So when we're providing response prompt and fading, we're gradually fading out our prompts so that individual can engage in that task independently. So we deliver specific prompts concurrently or after the presentation of a discriminative stimulus. That stimuli that cues that individual to engage in that specific step. And also, it's designed to reduce errors. So when we're using response prompting and fading, and we're doing it correctly, it really is an errorless learning strategy. So we want the person to be successful in completing these specific job tasks. So this is an example of a prompt hierarchy. And if you've worked in the disability field for long enough, you've probably seen something analogous to this. This is something that we use all the time in terms of teaching. So the prompt hierarchy is just a hierarchy of prompts that we utilize in order to teach or assist an individual to recognize that stimulus that cues him or her to engage in that step. So the prompt hierarchy goes from least intrusive to most intrusive. So an example up on the top would be a gesture. So that would be something like pointing to something. An indirect verbal would be, hey, what's next? You need to be engaged in something without telling the person what they need to be doing. And then a direct verbal. The direct verbal is, hey, you need to ladle the sauce on the pizza. A model is showing the individual how to model or how to ladle the sauce on the pizza. And then a partial physical would be maybe you're giving a little prime to get the person's arm to move over to ladle the pizza. And then a full physical would be hand over hand. And I always work off this assumption that most of the time in an employment setting, when we're prompting an individual to complete a task, we're only going to be using a gesture an indirect verbal, a direct verbal, and perhaps a model. The only time I've ever used a partial physical or a full physical if I'm shaping a behavior and I'm working on fine motor skills or anything. So those partial physical and full physical isn't to force somebody to do something. So in an employment setting, going back to what I was talking about in terms of instructional guidelines for instruction, least intrusive, we want to use the least intrusive strategies that produce the result. And most of the time, that gesture, indirect verbal, direct verbal, and model will suffice. So the guidelines for utilizing these specific prompts in any form of instructional format is that we want to select those least intrusive but effective prompts. I've already stated this, the importance of this. So we want to use the prompt that's going to get the job done, but it's not very intrusive. Okay? We can combine prompts, so we can use what's called a prompt blend to get an individual. So it might be, I could use like a gesture and an indirect verbal as like pointing to something and saying, hey, what's next? We also want to use natural prompts that are natural, that naturally occur. We also want to make sure that we provide prompts only when the person is attending. So this is an important point. If I'm teaching somebody a new skill, I want to ensure that they are attending to the skill that we're teaching. If they're not, you can't teach that individual that specific skill. So you need to ensure that the person is attending when we're teaching. That we want to provide prompts in a very supportive, instructive manner, and then fade out those prompts as soon as possible, because we do not want to see an individual in any context be dependent on a provider or an instructor. Other couple important pieces here that I think we need to mention is something about reinforcement. So when I'm working in an employment context or teaching an individual a new skill, reinforcement is really important. We all like to be reinforced, right? So when I'm teaching somebody a new skill, I want to make sure that I'm providing consistent and reliable reinforcement. And that is just positive verbal reinforcement. That's the only reinforcement I really need to provide in an employment setting. That's natural. That's the way that's the way all of us are reinforced, is through that kind of that verbal reinforcement. You're doing a great job. Hey, that looked really good what you did. Unfortunately, what I've seen throughout my career and what I still see happening is that we oftentimes use food or token economies to get people with intellectual developmental disabilities, people with more significant support needs, to engage in a task. And I'm going to tell you all, or really reinforce, that we shouldn't be doing that. We should not be using food or any form of token economies to get an individual to engage in the task. So if we've done our job well during discovery, the task in and of themselves should be reinforcement, because we figured out what that person wants to do, and we shouldn't have to use food or token economies to get the person to engage in that task. We should just simply provide positive verbal reinforcement when that individual engages in completion of a specific customized employment task. Error correction. So when we all make mistakes, and all of us make mistakes during instruction, people with disabilities are no different. So when we are teaching an individual, we want to make sure that we are engaged in appropriate error correction. So when I talk about error correction, it's not punitive. We're not like punishing the person for making an error. We're just simply telling the person that they didn't complete that target behavior correctly. So going back to the task analysis, if they didn't complete that step correctly of ladling the sauce on the pizza dough, then I have to correct it. And I have to say, oh, you didn't do it right, let's try it again. And then I just repeat the step. That's all I do during that error correction, during the error correction phases. So reinforcement, positive verbal reinforcement, is all we need to provide to an individual. No food, no token economies, and good solid error correction. So this is kind of a framework for instruction. Now I want to get into a couple of instructional strategies that are based on empirical evidence. So there's been research on each one of these specific strategies, and so I'll review these, each one of these strategies, so you have a good understanding of how we might implement these in an employment setting. And there are a number of other response prompting strategies as well. I chose to focus on only 2 of these strategies, one of which is a constant time delay, and the other is called a system of least prompts. And each one of these have been, data has been collected and research has been published on the efficacy of each one of these instructional strategies. So constant time delay is a fairly simple strategy that can be utilized in an employment setting with very little effort. It takes some time to kind of think through how you want to implement the strategy and develop the task analysis. But once all that's done, you can really develop a constant time delay procedure pretty easily. And the specific steps to a constant time delay are, first, you want to identify what cues that individual to respond, right? So if I'm making a pizza, I got to identify how I'm going to get that person to engage in that activity. And then I also have to identify the controlling prompt. So the controlling prompt is the prompt that consistently and reliably gets a person to complete a specific task on a task analysis or step on a task analysis. So we have non-controlling prompts and controlling prompts. The controlling prompt is the one that I know will always get that person to engage in that specific step, to complete that specific step with consistently. Okay. I also want to assess the individual's ability to wait for a prompt. So when we're utilizing a constant time delay, we're going to insert a predetermined amount of seconds before we deliver that prompt. So we allow that person to respond before we provide that specific prompt. So we need to determine, once again, going back to the discovery process, what that might look like. Like if we're going to utilize a constant time delay, I want to know that individual's ability to wait for that specific prompt. And then we also utilize what's called a 0-second delay trial in a constant time delay to ensure that the person can engage in the steps that we want him or her to engage in. So the 0-second time delay, we typically do 2 or 3 trials at a 0-second time delay just to ensure that the person can complete each one of those steps in the task analysis. And then once we've established the 0-second delay trial, then we move to the 3-second time delay. And we determine that length of the delay interval. Typically, it's 2 or 3 seconds. So when I'm implementing constant time delay, I provide that task direction. I say, hey, it's time to make a pizza. And then I insert 3 seconds. I just count to myself 1, 2, 3, and I provide that controlling prompt, that prompt that's always going to elicit the response that I want. So in this case, it would be a verbal prompt, just punch down the pizza dough. So there are different responses that we can see in a constant time delay program. The first is correct responses, right? So we can have unprompted correct responses and prompted correct responses. And an unprompted correct response is the individual makes a correct response before that controlling prompt is delivered. So if I say, hey, it's time to make a pizza, and that person immediately goes and punches down the dough on that first step of the task analysis, I would mark that as an unprompted correct response. But if I say, hey, it's time to make pizza, and I wait the 3 seconds and I deliver that controlling prompt, and then the person makes the correct response after that prompt is delivered, that is a prompted correct response. So when we see these happening, and in terms of an instructional approach, we respond to each one of these responses with just that verbal reinforcement. Hey, you did a really good job. When there's certain errors that we can see in a constant time delay program, one of which is an unprompted error. So these unprompted errors, the individual responds incorrectly before the controlling prompt is delivered, or the individual responds incorrectly after the controlling prompt is delivered. So when this happens, we want to just implement that error correction procedure that I talked about earlier, meaning I say, hey, you didn't do that step right, let's try it again, and I just error corrected. And then, of course, we can have no response errors. So those no responses are the individual just doesn't respond after that controlling prompt. And in these cases, I might want to go back and look at that controlling prompt, and I might have to go up one level higher in order to elicit that response that I need. So this is an example of a data sheet. It might be hard to see on the screen, but all of you have the PowerPoint so you can download it. But this data sheet, takes the steps of the task analysis, and then I'm just simply tracking prompted correct responses and unprompted correct responses. And then I calculate a percentage at the bottom of the data sheet. So it's a very simple system, just simply marking what an individual did in terms of prompted correct responses and unprompted correct responses. So this serves as your data collection system. Then you can start graphing the data. So in this example, I've just created a simple line graph of what's happened in terms of that person's acquisition of building that pizza. So I collect baseline, and then what I want to see happening is the unprompted correct response has an accelerating trend line, and the prompted correct responses has a decelerating trend line. So once that acceleration happens, I can reliably say that learning is occurring, and I start fading out my responses. So constant time delay is a really effective way, a really easy way to teach an individual a new employment task in a customized employment setting. It's simple to implement. With little effort, you can create nice data sheets and nice data collection systems to implement the customized employment or the constant time delay. Pardon me. The second one, strategy, is called the system of least prompts. This one is a little more, has a little more detail to it, in that we have to use at least 3 levels of the prompt hierarchy. So when I'm implementing a system of least to most prompts, I have to use 3 specific levels in order to effectively use the system of least prompts. And that first level in that prompt hierarchy is independent, like that the opportunity to respond without prompting. And the second and subsequent levels include prompts that are arranged from the least intrusive to the most intrusive. So using this system, we start with giving the person the opportunity to respond without a prompt, and then we start moving up the hierarchy from the least intrusive to the most intrusive until that person engages in that behavior that we want. So the steps of a least to most prompting program is that we need to identify that stimulus that cues the employee to respond. So is it that task direction? Is that me saying, hey, it's time to make a pizza? Or is that material, like seeing the pizza on the prep station and the pre-made pizza dough or whatever, and that person has to go over and start building those specific pizzas? So we really need to make sure that that person understands, or we know what that stimulus is to get that individual to respond, okay? And that they're attending during instruction. Then we select the number of levels in the hierarchy. So we have to make sure that we have an appropriate level of levels in that specific hierarchy, and that we identify that controlling prompt. Once again, that prompt that will always and reliably get that person to respond. That's going to be the most intrusive level, and then we provide least intrusive levels prior to going to that controlling prompt. Okay? So when we're thinking about this, we really have to think about the complexity of the tasks that an individual is engaged in. So chain tasks, we might need to use a couple more levels on the hierarchy to really get a person to respond, simply because that task might be fairly complex. We also have to look at the employer characteristics. So once again, this goes back to the discovery process about how a person is going to most effectively learn. Will they respond to specific prompts? How do they respond to specific prompts? And these are really important pieces of developing a really solid employment training program in terms of customized employment. So steps to developing a least to most prompting employment instructional program. Select the type of prompts to be used, and I've already kind of reinforced this. This is based on what you know about how the employee will learn. And again, this goes back to discovery. So everything that we're talking about always goes back to that discovery process. So you're really learning about what makes that person tick. You're really learning about how they're going to respond best in different settings. And then we sequence prompts from the least assistance to the most assistance. So we always start with that least that least intrusive prompt, and then we move up to that controlling prompt, the most intrusive, that's going to reliably elicit the response that we're looking at. And then we determine that appropriate response interval. So like a constant time delay, I'm going to insert a couple seconds before I deliver the prompt. So before I move up that hierarchy, I wait 2 seconds. And then if the individual still doesn't do what I would like him or her to do, or what's required of the task, I wait 2 more seconds before I deliver the next prompt, and so on, until I get to that controlling prompt that's going to reliably result in the person completing that task. So like constant time delay, there's some kind of rules to responding to correct responses. So when an individual responds correctly, we follow unprompted and prompted correct responses with that verbal reinforcement. So you can see that this idea of verbal reinforcement is really important. Hey, you did a great job. That was a great job ladling the sauce on the pizza, or whatever the task might be. And then during acquisition, when the person's learning that skill, that important acquisition phase, that we're reinforcing immediately after each correct response. And as they start to acquire the skill, we gradually reinforce that, gradually fade that reinforcement to natural levels. So we don't want the person to just wait for our reinforcement all the time. The reinforcement should be completing the task. And once again, make sure that reinforcement is age appropriate. And it's just hey, you're doing a good job, great job completing that specific task. And then responding to incorrect responses. So when a person doesn't respond correctly on the task analysis, we interrupt that incorrect response or no response, and deliver the next prompt, the next level on the prompt hierarchy. So I would stop the response, or if there was no response, and then I'd just go to that next level on that prompt hierarchy until it elicits that correct response. So this is just an example of how you would utilize a least to most strategy, and kind of an illustration. Hopefully it makes sense. The first level, when I'm implementing an instructional program for an individual with a disability in a customized setting, or a supported employment setting, or whatever the setting might be, that I present that target stimulus. So going back to the pizza, I say, hey, Jack, it's time to make a pizza. And I wait. If I predetermine that the 3-second interval is what I'm going to use, I wait 3 seconds. I just count to myself 1, 2, 3. If there's a correct response, I provide a verbal reinforcement, and then I move to the next step on the task analysis. If there's not a correct response, however, then I go to the second level, right? I say, hey, Jack, it's time to make a pizza, and then I go to that the next least intrusive prompt. So I would say, hey, what's next? Which would be an indirect verbal. And if there was a correct response, I go back over to the correct response column, and then go to the next step on the task analysis. But if there's not a correct response, I've waited my 3 seconds, then I go to the next level, the third level. Jack, it's time to make a pizza. Please ladle the sauce on the pizza. If there's a correct response, I move over to the correct response column and go to the next step on the task analysis. If there's still not a correct response, then I go to that fourth level, which would be the controlling prompt, the one that's going to reliably and consistently elicit the response that I want. And I would say, hey, Jack, it's time to make a pizza. Let's ladle that sauce on the pizza. And then he would ladle the sauce on the pizza. So this is just an illustration of how one could use the system of least prompts in an instructional, in an employment instructional setting. So once again, here's a data sheet. So when I'm collecting data on least to most, I'm just keeping track of the type of prompt that the individual needed, and hopefully that we're going to have rapid acquisition if we utilize the least to most prompting strategy efficiently. So I just keep track of what prompt level the individual completed each step on the task analysis. And what I hope to see is something like this. If I graph my data, that we see an accelerating trend, and that we get the person up to 100% accuracy on the steps of the task analysis. And typically, I've done a couple research studies on teaching people in employment settings using a system of least to most prompts, and there's another strategy called the system of most to least prompts. And typically, when I'm implementing these strategies, we're seeing acquisition in pretty quick, 10 instructional trials, and individuals are maintaining that skill after instruction is stopped. So we know the stuff works if it's implemented systematically, and if we collect good solid data on the outcome of instruction. So what strategy should you use? This is referring back to the study that I was just talking about. I conducted a study in 2018 where we looked at different prompting strategies in employment settings, and what we found is that there's no correct strategy to use. Typically, each prompting strategy leads to the acquisition of an employment task. The learners that were included in this study, all acquired the task, all rapidly acquired the task on each one of the prompting styles. So what we kind of surmised is that when we're thinking about what specific strategy to use, we're really going to look at the learning styles and preferences of the employee and the difficulty of the employment task, right? So if it's a really complex task, we're going to maybe select maybe the least to most prompting strategy because it provides a little bit more support. If the task isn't that difficult and where the individual just having some struggles on a couple of the steps on a task analysis, a constant time delay might suffice. So you really have to look at the complexity of the task, and going back to that learning style, you really have to consider the learning style of the individual that you're working with, and that goes back to the discovery process. So when you're engaged in discovery, you want to figure out how best this person learns and how best this person responds. And then a second kind of consideration is staff training and knowledge of each prompting procedure. So this goes back to my initial assertion when I started this webcast that one of the things that we're seeing is that folks don't necessarily understand how to do systematic instruction and utilizing some of these strategies. So, we really have to consider who's implementing each one of these strategies and their understanding of how to implement them and how to complete solid data collection systems. So staff training and knowledge is really important. And the complexities of some of these prompting strategies, some are more complex than others, and so we really have to consider staff knowledge and what they understand about each one of these specific prompting procedures. So what we know when we're thinking about instruction in customized employment is that we have to utilize strategies that we know work. We have to utilize strategies that are based on empirical evidence. And constant time delay and a system of least to most prompts are both instructional strategies, are both response prompting strategies that are rooted in evidence, that there is research supporting the utility of each one of these models, each one of these instructional strategies. So we need to ensure that we're utilizing those and teaching an individual to learn a new customized employment task or acquire a new customized employment task. So if you have questions about any form of instructional strategy or response prompting in particular, feel free to contact me. My contact information's there via email. I can respond to any questions. So I thank you for your time today, and email me questions if you have them.
Thanks, Terry. Sure appreciate it. That was a great presentation. There was a lot of information packed in there. We do have a couple of questions already. First of all, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. It's so great to have folks joining us and learning a little bit more with us each time. Just a reminder, we are putting on webinars just about every week. If you keep an eye on our Project E3 website, www.projecte3.com, we'll be publicizing our upcoming webinars and other topics that we may have folks presenting. I want to welcome Vicki Brooke. She is one of our partners in Project E3, and she's here today to answer some of the questions that folks have about Tim's presentation. Vicki, do you want to just introduce yourself briefly and tell folks about yourself?
Oh gosh, I don't want to bore them right out of the gate here. So my name is Vicki Brooke, and I'm with Virginia Commonwealth University Rehabilitation Research and Training Center. And I've been here for a very long time, long before I ever had to dye my hair. I was probably one of the country's original job coaches. So I've been a job coach. I also manage. I do not manage. That's a lie. I have 15 employment specialists that I work with. They probably manage me, who are doing this every single day. So I feel very close to this content, and I'm ready to take questions.
Sounds fantastic. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. It seems a few of our questions are about the statement that Tim made about food and token economies. There seems to be some concern around that. And one of our watchers said this is something that school parents and behavioral specialists use to ensure that a person completes tasks and learns tasks successfully. And one of our respondents said, so is it wrong for us to use food, as this is the type of reinforcement that is used for one of my clients that the employment specialist is working with? I think that's something that really has been used a lot in the past. And do you think that, is it recommended that that's discontinued if you already have it in place with a consumer, or is it something that you do moving forward with any new consumers? Or do you recommend that folks be weaned away from using that kind of reinforcement?
Okay, so well, the first question was, is it wrong? I would have a hard time saying it's wrong. Just from, so you remember, you're listening, it's Vicki Brooke, not Tim Riesen. So he seemed very emphatic about no food, no token economy systems. And this is what I'd say. We do work with a lot of young people coming out of school who may have gotten edible reinforcers in order to elicit the behavior that the teacher was looking for. So they have become dependent upon this edible reinforcer. So handing somebody an M&M on a job site is just not appropriate. But if that's what it takes initially, I have used sips of coffee, because a coffee is something that that would be typical in a work environment. I have used sips of soda if the person finds that reinforcing. So I have used that. I want to move them from that edible to a more of a typical reinforcer, which would be good filling up the glasses, or good ladling the sauce on the pizza. So I want to get them to respond and to be reinforced by verbal reinforcement. But I would have to take them from where they're at to where I want to get them to. So
it can be a progression.
So
it doesn't
would use the edible. I would not use M&Ms. I would use something that is typical in that environment. I would make sure the reinforcement is done discreetly. But I would do it with a plan of how I'm going to get them from where they're at to where I want them to be at.
Okay,
that
so it can be a progression rather than a just cut someone off.
But I can't do this, right? Because we're all about the whole thing about customized employment and supported employment is figuring out who they are, where they're at in space and time, figuring out their support needs are, and then providing that support, and then thinning the support. Or Tim talked about how we would fade that support, which is typically instruction, but also the reinforcement will have to be thinned. And it's thinned, it's not completely faded, because we all have reinforcement in our work environment. Sometimes in some work environments, it's a lot thinner than other work environments, but there's some level of reinforcement that is always going to be there. And maybe some of that we have to put into place.
Sure.
So,
Well,
so the other piece of your question, I'm sorry, you were going to
no,
say?
that's okay. It makes total sense. You don't want to pull something away if people are used to it, but it sounds like really making sure that any reward systems are contextually appropriate for the workplace is going to create less work uh, for you in the long run, because you're going to have the behavior in place, and you're going to have a contextually appropriate reward system in place, and that's a good way to do it discreetly so nobody gets cut off from a reinforcement that they're used to, but that they are receiving reinforcements that are recognizable to them. And I think sometimes, just with my job, some of the reinforcement, it it'll sometimes come a lot at a time, or sometimes there'll be a long stretch between times when a person on a job gets reinforcement. So I think that it sounds wise to move people from something that might be troublesome in a workplace to something that's going to fit in better and not call attention to folks who are trying to do a good job.
And for some people, they may need a higher level of reinforcement.
Mm-hmm.
So we may have to work with a coworker that is going to provide that intermittent reinforcement, because that's what it's going to take to keep that work performance going. So we would set that up within the work environment. So we would thin it as much as we can, but then we would go to a natural support for that.
Super.
The other thing that Tim talked about was a token economy system.
Right.
So for a lot of people, so in the old days we would get, I don't know how many old days there are for people out there. But we used to, hey folks, we used to get a paper check. That was our paycheck, and it would be like sometimes on like cardstock, and it'd be in a cute little envelope. Well, that doesn't happen anymore.
No.
So it was hard, even when you would receive like a paper paycheck.
Mm-hmm.
So now we don't even receive that. It just ends up in our bank. So for a lot of our folks, we have to teach them that the paycheck is the reinforcer. Mm-hmm. They're not going to come to competitive integrated employment thinking like, yeehaw, it's a paycheck. My mama buys me whatever I want to. So lots of times we have to teach how the paycheck's reinforcing. So if you don't get paid till every 2 weeks, there may be intermittent reinforcement that they're going to get before the paycheck. So they save it up, so on paycheck day they can go out and maybe get their nails done. I don't know, I've gone shopping with guys who are buying wrestling magazines, but you're going to find those intermittent reinforcements, so they start connecting the reinforcer with the paycheck. So and it'll be based upon work performance.
And that seems like an experience-based work thing, where you need to associate the paycheck with the rewards that the paycheck can get you, and that can be a little bit of an abstract concept for folks until they've had a chance to actually spend some of the money from their check and see what kind of rewards. Since you don't get paid the moment you do the work, I'm sure that that's something that folks need to practice a couple of times before they're used to that actually being a tangible reward for them. So that totally makes sense.
But I guess the point that Tim was making, and maybe if he's here, he would clarify it too. Even if you do put that token economy system in place, you're going to have to, it has to be pulled out. I mean, you're going to have to, you have to know when you do that, where are you going? When, how do you get out of that? It doesn't continue forever and ever and ever.
Right. Well, I think we'll move on to the next question. Actually, I do have the PowerPoint up. Lisa Larson is asking, please clarify again the difference between the prompted level V and the prompt level M. So the implementation instruction, the levels go from the most comprehensive is FP for full physical, then there's PP for partial physical, then towards the middle is M for model, and then DV, sorry guys, DV for direct verbal, and then IV for indirect verbal, and then G for gesture. Lisa, if that didn't answer your question, just pop another question into the Q&A. But I think that's what she was asking.
So I'll just demonstrate the whole sequence, if that might
Super.
be helpful for
That's
everybody.
great.
So so your task analysis should be written as the verbal prompt. So lots of people in pre-service programs like VCU and other universities had in the past really taught how to develop a task analysis that might have a lot of language in it. I want to be able to, as an employment specialist on a job site, I want to be able to look down at my task analysis and I want to have the same verbal prompt every single time. So I would write, pick up the ladle, pick up the tomato sauce, pour the tomato sauce, spread the tomato sauce with the ladle. Those would be 4 separate steps. And they would be written, my task analysis would be written that way. So a verbal prompt would be, pick up the label. An indirect verbal prompt would be, Heidi, what's the next step? So I haven't given her the information, and I'm going to see if she has the information.
Right.
So the verbal prompt was the direct verbal prompt. That was the DP, pick up the ladle. Modeling would be, Heidi, pick up the ladle like this. And I would pick up the ladle. Then I would wait and see if Heidi picked up the ladle, and I would count 1,001, 1,002, 1,003. I wouldn't count it out loud. I'd kind of count it in my head. But I'm counting. After a while, you just know what it is. But you know,
right.
when you start doing this, you will count it out in your head. So partial physical assistance would be, I might take Heidi's hand and just like tap her wrist, and I would pair it with the verbal prompt. Heidi, pick up the ladle, and see if that elicits the response. If it did, then that would be a P, partial PP, partial physical assistance. If that still didn't do it, I put my hand over hand, pick up the ladle like this, Heidi, and we would do it together. So you know, if you give that much physical assistance, like the full hand over hand, or even the tapping of the wrist or tapping of the elbow, you then have to go back up that hierarchy.
Right.
So you would never want to provide that much assistance unless that's really what it required in order for the individual to elicit the response you wanted.
Sure.
So you want to start at the top and make sure that you can't get what you want just with a direct verbal prompt.
Right.
Or a modeling prompt. And so a gesture would be just pointing to the ladle and say, you know, pick up the ladle, and I just point to the ladle. That would be it. And if Heidi did it that way with that prompting, you would record a G. Did I do that correctly? Did that help? Let us know if that didn't help.
Yeah, we do have somebody who asked a little bit more detailed question about the ladle example in terms of labeling what you're going to mark down for the prompting. Using the ladle example, if the person consistently picks up the ladle but maybe gets too much or too little sauce in it, is that considered not correct? Or it's a partial correct and the instruction is given again until they get the correct amount of sauce and the ladle before applying? How would that work?
So what I would then do is insert another step in the task analysis. And so that step would be, if I'm putting sauce in the ladle, then it's like, I need to have a step in there to say how much sauce you put in the ladle. So fill the ladle halfway with sauce. You see what I mean? So then I've taken care of that. I had to add another step to the task analysis.
Right. And it seems to be some of these tasks, you know, I've heard the saying, you have to eat an elephant one spoonful at a time. You have to break down gigantic tasks into subtasks You know, it's a thing that I think we probably run into ourselves during project management. You don't just produce webinar. There are different steps that go into that, and each of those steps has to be kind of detailed out so that your team can do everything smoothly together.
But I think
So
that's a really good point. But the problem on a job site is that you could develop a task analysis that is just not efficient. So you could have 40 steps to a task analysis that's just not going to be efficient for an employment specialist to use.
right.
So I would rather to err on fewer steps and then run into that problem that was just pointed out. What about, you know, they don't put the right quantity, then I know I need to insert another step in the task analysis.
Sure.
And then that becomes part of my instruction. So you kind of walk, and okay, so this is why you can't buy a textbook and have all those task analysis and just use them like as a recipe book, because every work site is different, every client is different. I could teach 4 different clients to do the same task, and they're going to have a different task analysis, because I'm going to develop the task analysis based upon their own individual support needs.
Yep, variables, those variables.
Yeah.
You have to make sure that it's contextually appropriate and right for the person as well. So
yeah, and I think it's different how you provide, well, it's very different how you provide instruction in a classroom and how you provide instruction on a job site.
Definitely. Danielle Smith has a question. Was this presentation based on a particular customized employment model?
Well, he was talking about customized employment in general, and then he would intermittently use supported employment. But whether you're doing customized employment or supported employment, the job site training phase is going to look the same way. Because here it is, folks. Good instructions, good instruction, good instruction. So you're going to provide the same type of work-based instructional strategies, whether it's support employment or customized employment.
I think that probably answers Danielle's question. If it didn't, Danielle, go ahead and pop another question in the QA for us. The next one we have, let's see here. Oh, well, we had a technical question. So, and then somebody thanking us for the presentation. So those are great. I'm going to go ahead and throw out a call for any more questions. And I think just out of curiosity for myself, can you tell me what error correction might look like? A place that I worked at before was working on children who had, you know, were acting out in the classroom, and kind of was one of the theories is, you know, you teach kids math and you teach kids English, but maybe they didn't get taught behavior appropriate to the academic environment. So you're trying to teach them the behaviors, and this sounds like a similar thing. If you're doing error correction, how do you reteach that behavior, and what would that look like before being on a job site, and what would that look like maybe on a job site? So
it looks very different when it's in the classroom, is what I'll say. You can do a variety of things. When you're on the job site, what I want to make sure is employment specialists, this isn't the only person they're serving. This is the person they're serving right now. And there's expectations for them to be able to be very efficient with their time, because Department of Rehab Services, who may be paying for them for their hourly rate or Medicaid waiver, they want them to be able to, and also for our client, we don't want them to become dependent upon the employment specialist to be efficient with their time and to fade from their job site. So I do not want my new employee to learn an error, because if they learn the error, they have to unlearn it and relearn the correct way. So I have more time I have to invest.
Right.
So as soon as I see the error, I want to interrupt it immediately and begin instruction right there. So
how would you do that?
I would, it could be, and it wouldn't be part of your it can be part of your data collection. It's not part of what we were shown today, but I would just interrupt it. If there was filling glasses with water and the water spreading all over, I'm going to take the pitcher away, and then I'm going to set it aside, and then I'm going to find time to provide clean, systematic instruction. So you would do it, you would interrupt through air any way that is appropriate in that setting, but just to stop the work. So typically it's not generally a behavior. It's just you're doing the task incorrectly.
Right.
So it really is more of instruction. If it's an issue of behavior, that's going to look very different than what Tim was talking about today.
Yeah, so in those situations, I suppose that it's also going to not only depend on the work environment, but also what the person responds best to. And like Tim was saying, that you find out a lot of that in discovery. So
you really do. You really find out the kinds of not only discovery helps us to direct the job search, but it really helps us for instruction on the job site, what they like, what they don't like, what they respond to. You do not want to use hand over hand or any kind of physical prompting with somebody with perhaps autism who is very tactile defensive.
Right.
I mean, you're going to create a whole issue for yourself. So
right.
that kind of information you really need on the front end. If we don't have any more questions, I have something I could share. Is there more questions?
Right now we don't.
So there is an assessment strategy that Tim did not talk about, and it's called probe data. So has anybody heard of probe data? Okay, no. All right, so I'll just talk about it. So there's this strategy that you would then use your task analysis. So you have that in your lab. So you provided instruction all week. And I just want to take a quick and dirty assessment of where they're at in learning this particular task. So without any prompting and without any reinforcement, and this is the really hard part for employment specialists, because we like to provide that reinforcement. We like to say, doing a nice job, or good picking that up, or good doing that. So you'd have to so if there's somebody like me who likes to do, I usually as an employment specialist would have, I would wear clothing with pockets. So I'd have my hands down in a way, and without any prompting and reinforcement, I would find out exactly how much of that task analysis that they can complete independently. Why without any prompting or reinforcement? Because ultimately that's where we're going with this individual.
Right.
So, and it also shows me exactly where to begin my instruction.
Sure.
So Tim talked about not having to provide instruction on the whole task because you're going to zero in on certain tasks that are certain steps that the individual is really having trouble with. Well, the probe data helps you know exactly where to begin instruction.
And Vicki, is there a site or someplace that folks can go to if they want to get more information on that?
Yes, we can.
BCRRTC?
Yeah, we can. Can I send you something, Heidi?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll send
We can
you
include it in the email that we'll send out to everybody tomorrow with the information on getting their CRCs. So we can include any extra resources that you'd like to share with folks in that.
Yeah, I can send more detailed information.
That sounds great. Yeah, and definitely it sounds like that's the end point that you want people to get to, is to be able to do that sequence without any prompting. And you need to do that gradual sort of release of responsibility from you to the person so that they can make it through their tasks on their own. And I think with all of us, we just whether or not you have an obstacle like a disability, there are parts of our jobs that it takes a while to learn, or parts that you're better at and parts that you have to take more time with. And it makes sense just from a general perspective too, that getting folks where they need to be in order to do their jobs well, it doesn't happen overnight. So doing that, being patient and finding out what works best with your folks, that also is of value. it's kind of a reward to be able to do it well and get through a sequence and be able to, get the reinforcement. Yeah, you did that right. I do have a few more questions that have come in. Edwin has asked, can the task analysis be for a consumer who is simply needing assistance with job skills training? In this case, the consumer is not receiving customized employment nor supported employment services.
Absolutely. I use task analysis with my husband all the time.
Tell me how that works.
Yeah, it's the reinforcer that you have to pay
Right.
attention to. Yeah, this is how you load the dishwasher.
Mm-hmm. Well,
yeah,
good job unloading the dishwasher that way.
Really, I mean, seriously, it's just good instruction. I mean, if it's not one of our clients, then it may have fewer steps in the task analysis, but it's still, I mean, when you learn how to operate your computer for the first time, all those books are written in task analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Step 1, step 2, step 3. So yeah.
Yeah, I come from a technical writing background, so
Yes.
I actually enjoy writing the task analysis for running a website for our folks who are backing us up. It's kind of fun for me. That's the intrinsic reward for me, is being able to write a task analysis. So
there you go.
Let's see here. We have Teresa asking, and this might be a question, Jen Gunlaclat, for you. Are there any training materials readily available already that we could use to provide training to our staff on the 2 strategies Tim presented? Of course, we're going to send along the PowerPoint as a PDF that was in the chat. It will also be on our website afterwards. The full recording of this webinar training will be available. It takes a little while because we have everything captioned and we have to upload and things like that. So there are the technical things that we need to clean up on our end. But any of the things that you learn here, we welcome you to use them, and we encourage you to use them. We wanted to make sure this webinar series is something that people can take out and directly apply. It's kind of an applied learning model for all of our folks. So the things that come in the email tomorrow, Teresa, if you're looking for something beyond that, after you've looked at the materials and everything that we send you through the mail tomorrow, through the email tomorrow, maybe you could reach out to us and let us know a little bit more specifically what you're looking for. But we do share all this information. The PowerPoint is turned into a PDF. You can share that with folks. But I think that's how I can answer that for now. And if it doesn't suit your needs, then we can get you more information. Brian asks, where's this video uploaded? We upload all of our videos to the Project E3 website. Like I mentioned before, www.projecte, and then the number 3.com. And we have a tab on the top that says webinars and webcasts. So if you click on there, it will tell you about our upcoming webinars, and it will tell you about our archived webinars. So actually we have over a dozen really good videos like this one that you can access anytime that you want to. So again, that's www.projecte3.com, and then the webcasts webinars tab on the top that will get you where you need to go. I think that information is probably in the email that Jen is going to send out to, just in case people didn't have their pens ready to go. So I think that takes care of the questions that we have in the question and answer queue. Vicki, is there anything else that you want to share with your experience as having been, a job coach for such a long time that you think maybe newer people would benefit from? Anything that you can share that builds on what Tim had to say today?
Tim provided a lot of information. You're not going to use those strategies on the job site and immediately feel comfortable.
Right.
So it takes time and not too scary, but it probably takes like a good year of applying those skills on a job site to feel really comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
So it does kind of feel uncomfortable. Tim talked about data. So I often ask employment specialists, do you think it's a luxury to collect data? If you don't have a task analysis and you're not collecting data, you will not know how to fade. You might have a feeling like, God, I think Heidi's doing better today. But if I had data, I would know Heidi moved from a modeling prompt to a gesture. Learning's occurring. She had a less intrusive prompt. Unless you wrote that down, I doubt whether you would know that.
And also,
So
if you're dealing with more than one consumer, you can't probably
you're gonna
remember
leave
all
that
of it
job
for
site,
everybody.
You're going to go to another job site, and you know, then you're going to start this process again with this person tomorrow. So an employment specialist has a lot of things going on. You won't know how to fade. So it's all about providing really clean, clear instruction so you can fade from that job site as they become more proficient. And you don't want them to become dependent upon you and you stay too long at a job site. So data is not a luxury. It's really critical to the process. You don't always feel comfortable with that, but you're going to have these little nasty data sheets depending on where you're at, and they're going to be folded up and in your pocket, and you're going to pull it out and make some notes, so when you leave, if you have a lot of people around you, you're not making a big thing of collecting data, but you're getting the information.
Yeah.